As I'm currently working on volume 4 of Psychedelic Essentials, which is my preset packs for Serum, I thought now would be a great time to show you some tricks in the world of sound design. So that's what I'm going to do today, starting off with this patch over here. As you can see, this is already saved as a preset in the pack. And one of the cool things that we're doing inside of this particular patch is using the noise oscillator as a modulator. Now, probably you've seen this trick used in other tutorials, but in this particular case, we're using it in a very specific way, in that we're using it on a phaser over here. I cannot actually show you the modulation because obviously there's nothing that I can click on like an envelope or an LFO for the noise oscillator. So here you can see it is affects filter frequency. And you can see that it's affecting it very, very little. Now the noise oscillator, you can use that in a bunch of different ways. In this particular case, you may have noticed that we set up the LFO over here. And the benefit of doing that is that you can get a really fast LFO, which is tied to the key, because you can pitch track this noise oscillator. You can see we had to tune it up quite a few semitones over here to get it in the same key as the sound that we're actually playing, to make sure that the modulation is actually fast enough for what we want to do here, which is really quickly modulate the phaser between two positions. Down below here you can see the shape that we're using, so you can imagine that it's jumping from the highest position of the modulation to the lowest position of the modulation. And it's doing that at a frequency which is in key with the sound that is going into it. Meaning that half of the waveform is going to get the phaser in one position and the other half of the waveform is going to get the phaser in another position. And of course, we have smoothed it out a little bit, so 1/4 of the time it is taking to go from one position to the other and then from the other position back up to the first position. Now we've given this phaser a lot of resonance because we really want this effect to pop out, and you can hear the difference if I turn it on and off. You can hear that without this phaser, it sounds like the tonality of the sound is jumping all over the place. And it's almost like the phaser adds a little bit of stability to that tone, because you can hear that lower frequency kind of moving back and forth, which is purely there because we're moving the filter cutoff so quickly. So you can kind of think of it in the sense that we're using this shape and this high pitch over here to generate a key, which we then superimpose on the sound that is going into this filter. So you can make any sound over here, and then you're just going to add like a layer on top of it, which in this case just alters the tonality of the sound. The next sound is this one over here. This is a very basic FM sound, although we're using 3 oscillators, which is going to be the trick here. As you can see though, this is still a patch that I'm experimenting with, so there's not a lot of stuff happening in the effects other than the delay and the reverb. Of course, we're removing some of the lower frequencies and we're giving it a little bit of stereo wave as well. But the main idea here is that we're using one oscillator to FM another oscillator, and then this oscillator is in turn being FM'd by the sub-oscillator over here. Now to really show you what that does, I've opened up Phaseband over here. What I'm going to do is just create a few oscillators. I'm just going to set them all to sine modes over here so that we can see exactly what is going on. And I'm just going to use that to phase modulate this first sine wave over here. Now the way that FM really works in this particular case through the phase is that it's moving the starting position of the waveform, meaning that the starting position of this waveform moves back and forth really quickly. And you can see that in that here where it's moving really quickly, where the starting position is changing really fast, you can see that we have a higher frequency over here. And then where it's not changing as fast, you can see that we have a lower frequency. And in fact, here you can see it inverting because this waveform is inverting, and then it's speeding up again. You can also see that when the playback position is moving forward, you get more oscillations than when it's moving backwards. But essentially, you can see that through 2 very simple waveforms, we get a more complex waveform. Now, what happens if we double that effect? Well, you'll see that it's kind of exponential growth, in that I can FM this one over here, and that has a crazy effect on the one above. Now let's say that I take this one over here and FM here. You can see how big of an impact this has on this final sound over here. So essentially the idea is, if you want a more complex and a little bit of a richer FM tones, use multiple oscillators that kind of form these FM chains. Now Phaseband is ideal for this because you can FM basically anything with anything. So I could take this oscillator and also FM this oscillator over here, and you can see what kind of noise that produces. Let's modulate this one over here as well. Now I know for a fact that this is probably going to be a horrible texture. It's basically just noise, but you can see that this is achieved through some very, very complex FM setup. Now going back to this patch, obviously Serum, it is a little bit less complex. You only have 3 oscillators to work with, but you can create this change in that oscillator A is being FM'd by oscillator B, and on oscillator B is being FM'd by the sub-oscillator over here. One of the things to keep in mind if you want the sound to be consistent is to keep the randomization of the phase off. Of course, because we're changing the starting position of the waveform, if the waveform has a random starting position, that has a massive impact on the FM texture. Now, as I showed in the last example, FM is really useful for gritty tones, but that is not the only way. Here we have a setup where we just have a default saw wave with a remap on it. The remap shape looks like this, but that doesn't really matter. All that we're achieving is that we're creating a little bit more of a complex waveform, and then it's going through this high-pass filter, which is really only there to introduce the phase shift. As you can see, we have a phase shift over here, and that phase shift is going to be applied to the phases of the oscillator over here once it goes through the filter. But that is all very complex, and the main reason why I'm doing this is I want to basically make the waveform as complex as possible. And the reason for that is this crazy shape in the distortion that you see over here. If I open up the shape in the edit mode, you'll see something very complex in here. And you can imagine that the waveform going through a remap like this is going to be very drastic. To show you what I mean, I'm first going to turn off all of the effects that we have over here, and I'm just going to load an oscilloscope. Let's see if we can see the tone here. You can see it on the oscilloscope. And this is just this waveform with the high-pass filter applied over here. And of course, this is introducing a phase shift, which is why the waveform doesn't actually look like this. Now, I've actually done a full video on these kind of distortion curves and how to read them, so this is going to be a quick rundown. But you can essentially imagine, because this is an asymmetric curve, as you can see, we have asymmetry over here. You can see that everything that is happening in the positive side of the waveform is happening over here, and everything that is happening in the negative side of the waveform is happening over here. So the x-axis is our input volume. Whenever the sample of the waveform is maybe at this volume over here, this is where it's going to read. And then it's just going to be remapped to a different output volume, which will be on the y-axis. So you can imagine that if we have one sine wave oscillation going up and down, we turn that in multiple oscillations because it's going up, down, down, and then back up again. And this is going all the way to the negative side. So while before we had a waveform that would kind of go up and down once, the output is going up and down multiple times in the span of that one oscillation that the input was going up and down, meaning that you get more higher frequencies and therefore you're going to get a more gritty texture. In this case, it also becomes a little bit louder, but you can see multiple spikes are being introduced once I turn up the drive, and therefore you get a grittier sound. Now with some extra effects, a simple MIDI pattern and a kick and bass, we get something like this. Now for the next two techniques, I actually want to show them in the context of a production, starting with this atmospheric idea over here. Now this idea is going to mainly focus on triggering the sound because that is an important aspect of sound design itself. Normally, if you go into any of my one-shots, what you'll see is that I'm triggering one long note. So that would be something like this, for example. Or this thing over here. In this case, it's even a little bit more complex because I'm playing a bunch of octaves. But here you can see, for certain sounds, it is really cool to do something different. And in this case, what I've done is I've built a ladder in the scale of my track, and it's just kind of arpeggiating up really quickly. Now this is just triggering an omnisphere patch. So sound design wise, I didn't really do much. I just found this patch over here. But you can hear that there's a lot of detail in the patch and that there's a lot of like extra little noise and something like that. And one of the cool side effects of using this rolling technique is because we're playing so many different notes, they're all kind of releasing on top of each other and they form this really nice, strong texture after it. So of course, yes, you're going to have the plugs kind of rising up, but notice that there's a really cool texture happening after it. Sometimes it doesn't play, sometimes it does, but for the last one you could hear that there was this like final sine wave that kind of moved up. So what I'll probably end up doing is freezing this or maybe recording it until I find a take that I'm happy with. Probably going to look for something that has a lot of that kind of effect happening. And then what I could even do to really turn this into an atmosphere is actually cut out the source material. For example, what I could do is have my black hole be fully wet. And then it just becomes an atmosphere. But in this particular case, I also like having the dry signal a little bit because I just like the sound of the roll itself as well. But you can imagine that in terms of atmospheric sound design, there's a lot that you can do with these kind of setups. The final trick that I want to show is just an effect which I really like. In this case, this is the spectral resonator. The way that I like to think of it is giving something a little bit of extra tonality. You can of course use this kind of effect on any kind of sound, but the place where it shines best, in my opinion, is vocals. You can see this vocal has some really strong effects on it. We already have this echo over here, which is tied to the key. As you can see, very low millisecond setting, which means that this is also going to function like a resonator, very similar to what this is doing over here. But without this spectral resonator, it just sounds thin. You can still hear that this has some vocoded qualities even with this bypass. That is because we have a vocoder over here. And then we also have M transformer over here, which is doing some format shifting and some pitch shifting. And one of the nice things about this spectral resonator over here is that you don't have to calculate the milliseconds yourself, because it comes with a key over here. You can also tie it to a frequency, but the key is just easier. And one of the things that this does is it allows you to have a sound that is out of key at one stage in the sound design process. So for example, over here, we're taking this vocal and M transformer is pitching it around. So it's bound to be out of the key of the track. And then it's kind of retuning it to the key of the track because it reintroduces that lower mid-range tonality into it, which is of course going to be tied to the key that you set over here. So as an effect, it is a very interesting way to add a little bit of extra tonality to the sound. And of course, you can also use it outside of vocals. Maybe if you have a little bit of a thin FM synth or something like that, this could be really powerful. So I guess a little free tip at the end here, just experiment with these kind of effects and see where you can apply them. But that's going to be it for today's video. I hope that you learned something and I hope that you enjoyed it. Let me know if you did by leaving a like and make sure that you're subscribed. Also feel free to comment more sound design tips if you know them. Another way to support the channel is by watching some more of my content. So I'll leave 2 videos up on the screen for you to choose from. So just pick one and enjoy, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.